Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's evaluative grant-making webinar. Here's the communities team, so if you have any questions following today's webinar, please reach out to your assigned program officer directly. The link in the bottom left corner of the PowerPoint directs you to a page on our website that lists each community statewide and includes the team member who works with the LCC in that particular community. We'll begin by discussing how many LCCs tend to evaluate their applications during their voting meetings and some of the challenges and issues that coincide with their existing processes. We'll then spend most of the webinar providing a framework for how LCCs can undergo a more evaluative grant-making process, what that entails, how to develop and implement it, and the benefits of adopting this process. We'll discuss how LCCs can use their own local criteria to develop an evaluative review process and other essential components, such as the score sheet and rubric. We'll also show examples of how some LCCs developed these tools for themselves. We will then delve into the two phases of this work, beginning with individual scoring and transitioning into group deliberations, which are often done during the voting meetings. Lastly, we'll cover a procedural overview for LCCs to implement this as early as the fiscal 26 cycle. And then we'll conclude with a few resources for LCCs to continue this work on their own. Last fall, we observed dozens of voting meetings and noticed many commonalities among the challenges and issues LCCs face regarding how to evaluate their applications and run their voting meetings. For example, one of the issues we observed, we later referred to as the minimum eligibility mindset. Now, this was when LCCs tried to fund literally every eligible project they feasibly could. And somewhat connected to that was also this fear or a hesitation of declining applicants. And this approach really kind of spread LCC's resources so thin that it resulted in a minimal impact across all of their grantees. Another struggle we noted was among LCCs that reviewed each individual application in a group setting. Now, this approach wastes time on applications where everyone seemed to share similar views at the expense of cutting deliberation time for the applications that had much more varied opinions among LCC members. Biased decision-making was another challenge many LCCs had to deal with. Typically, this occurred when subjective commentary and personal views were expressed during the voting meeting, and in some cases, these comments went as far as to appear to influence the overall decision that was made. And when that happens, it really unfortunately conveys an unfair and inconsistent process. For example, it often seemed that comments were based on whether an LCC member merely liked an application or not. And this really can't happen. Ultimately, granting decisions cannot be made based on the degree to which an LCC quote unquote likes an application. Instead, these decisions really need to be made based on the degree to which applications align with an LCC's local criteria or the state's default criteria if they don't have their own. Lastly, we noted some LCCs held what appeared to be unstructured voting meetings. This was when, commentary made during deliberations appeared to have no process for being qualified or quantified. In the end, it kind of gave the impression that some deliberations had no effect or correlation with the granting decision that was made. And overall, it kind of made the LCC's entire decision-making process seem somewhat arbitrary. Now we'll transition to discussing the various components that we mentioned are needed within the evaluative review process. The first is the score sheet, which is developed from an LCC's local criteria, which are the guidelines and or priorities they've adopted based on the community feedback they received through their community input process. A score sheet is really the most important evaluative tool for an LCC to develop, as it really kind of helps them identify the applications that most closely align with their local criteria. And while there are many different iterations of how a score sheet can be developed and what they look like, today we're going to approach this in its most simplified form. From that perspective, think of a score sheet as the inclusion of three different things. You'll need evaluative questions that are based on the LCC's local guidelines and or priorities. Each evaluative question will require a scoring mechanism. Typically, what we'll see is a binary score, such as a yes or no, or a scaled point system, typically within a 3 to 5 point range. Lastly, weighted values refer to the percentage of an applicant's total score each evaluative question will have. For example, each question can be worth the same percentage amount. Alternatively, some LCCs have prioritized some of their evaluative questions, allowing them to have a greater impact on the applicant's total score over some of their other questions. So this is an example by the Amesbury Cultural Council. So this is the score sheet that they used last year. As you can see, they have a space for the applicant's name and the title project up top. This appears to be based on a 40-point total score. They have priorities listed up top, which is really helpful for the evaluator as they're going through each particular application. They have 4 evaluative questions here, all of which have an even distribution of 10 total points. I'm assuming that that the 10, 6, and 2 things here are really kind of benchmarks. I would imagine that they would allow a reviewer to score anywhere between 1 and 10. And in terms of the questions themselves, these are common questions that we often see within a score sheet. So one question tending to be around the degree to which the application directly benefits residents of the LCC's community. Another one based around the budget or the funding aspect of the project. In this particular case, I do appreciate how they framed this by saying, quote, "This proposal is asking for a realistic amount of money." That really does allow the LCC members' expertise in this particular subject, if they have any, to really be much more discerning and allow that to kind of play a role in the overall evaluation. So I love the way that they framed that one in particular. Um, Planning is another aspect that we'll see often framed within score sheets. And then in this case, this is interesting as well. It seems like this question is this proposal meets one or more of the fiscal 25 grant priorities. Instead of creating an evaluative question around each priority separately, they pretty much just woven one particular question that allows the evaluator to essentially kind of factor in all the prioritizations that the LCC has, which I think does make that a little bit more efficient. Now, the next 2 slides provide examples of how a score sheet can be developed from local criteria, in this case, using Lynn Cultural Council as an example. Let's examine Lynn's local guidelines and compare them to the evaluative questions, scoring mechanism, and weighted values within their scorecard. Their first guideline states preferred applicants reside, work, and or have an organization or a business in Lynn or an established partnership with an organization or business in Lynn. The simplest way to do this is to rephrase the guideline sentence as a question. For example, is the applicant Lynn-based or collaborating with a Lynn-based organization is completely sufficient. The scoring mechanism they chose for this question was a binary one, allowing the evaluator to select yes or no. And this question would also account for 15% of the applicant's total score. Now, their second guideline was programs must take place in Lynn and significantly benefit its residents, which is something we see many LCCs adopt. In this case, 2 evaluative questions were developed in correlation to this particular guideline. Simply stated, the first is, does this proposal take place in Lynn and or significantly benefit Lynn residents? The scoring mechanism was also a binary yes/no option. In this case, a no pretty much meant an automatic rejection. However, they did allow LCC members to continue evaluating an application that they might say no to for this particular question if the project had a significant contribution to Lynn, despite taking place outside of the city. The second question was, what is the anticipated number of people to benefit? They applied a 5-point scale here and weighted the question to make up 15% of the applicant's total score. Their third guideline states the LCC will prioritize applications which demonstrate thorough planning. The evaluative question based on this guideline is simply how much detailed planning was demonstrated in the application. In this case, they developed a 4-point scale as a scoring mechanism and weighted the question to account for up to 15% of an applicant's total score. So this is the Lynn Cultural Council's Fiscal 25 scorecard. So here we could see the 6 other evaluative questions that they had based on their local guidelines and priorities for last year. And you have a good variety. So as you could see, the scoring mechanisms range from a binary yes/no to a 5, or in this case, even a 6-point scale. The weighting values range from being up to 5% of an applicant's total score to 15% of their total score. And then we could see a few new questions and topics here that we didn't necessarily see for Amesbury or Haverhill. So, for example, does this application specifically benefit youth? Is this application specifically related to education? And then lastly, would you agree this application could serve as a DEIA initiative and or services a marginalized group? So as you can see, there's a good amount of variety and there's no real single way to develop a scorecard or a score sheet or rubric. There really is a wide variety of ways in which these things can be developed. Rubrics, on the other hand, provide benchmarks and examples of each score that help evaluators understand the difference between each scoring option. For scaled questions with 4, 5, or more scoring options, it's relatively easier for an evaluator to discern the difference between the highest and lowest score. However, the middle options can be a lot harder to differentiate. So providing additional specificity or clarity for these options can be helpful to the evaluators. Here is another example of an LCC's document. In this case, this is Haverhill Cultural Council's grant evaluation rubric. So as you can see here, there's 4 particular aspects on this page. There's actually a 5th one down here on page 2. So as you can see, if you kind of read through them, each particular box does provide an area, an idea to which where, this particular score might end and another score might begin. And we are noticing a few trends already compared to Amesbury's score sheet. For example, there's an alignment, there's a community benefit, and a planning aspect to their scores. Well, this one's pretty new here, creativity and innovation, which is pretty interesting to show how they kind of scaled that out within 5 different points. What's also interesting within this particular rubric is it appears that for applicants who were granted the prior year, there's also an additional evaluation that they kind of go through internally. So it looks like they are checking to see if their paperwork was completed for the year prior, if the project was completed, and if they met the credibility requirements for the grantee. So that's pretty interesting too, the fact that they kind of couple that in with the rubric. And then there's some helpful guidance and understanding in terms of where a final score might land that particular application, which is really helpful for then preparing the LCC to have discussions once they go through the process. Next, let's discuss developing the 2 phases. The first phase is the individual scoring phase, which is conducted after the mid-October deadline and before the voting meeting. First, LCCs will divide their submitted applications among their voting members. The distribution of applications can be done evenly where everyone evaluates the same number of applications. Some LCCs categorize applications first, for example, by discipline type, and then give all the applications within a particular category to a specific LCC member with expertise in that category. Although, do keep in mind this distribution method may not always allow for applications to be distributed evenly. Some LCCs have all of their members review all applications. And while that is a thorough way of reviewing applications, it may not be a feasible approach for LCCs with fewer members that receive a higher number um, of applications. In these cases, LCCs will often assign applications in batches. Regardless of the method used, however, there should be at least 3 LCC members reviewing each eligible application. Next, reviewers will submit their evaluations, the process for which can vary from one LCC to the next. Essentially, submitting an evaluation means completing a score sheet for each application assigned to the LCC member, submitting scores and comments, if any, to someone, typically the person who will tally the scores, or something, such as entering this information within an Excel file. Again, scoring should be based on the degree to which the application aligns with the LCC's stated criteria. Next, individual scores are tallied and comments are compiled. And lastly, applications are listed in a ranked order, typically using an Excel file, and then sent to LCC members at least a few days before the voting meeting. The goal is to provide LCC members with sufficient time to review the cumulative scores and prepare their remarks to share during the next phase. At this point, this effectively sets the stage for the group deliberation phase, which will take place during the voting meeting. And again, as a friendly reminder, the open meeting law does not prohibit LCCs from sending information like this out to members to prepare them to deliberate during an upcoming meeting. However, what cannot happen whatsoever, though, is deliberating over email. Therefore, because of that, we recommend sending emails like this out by BCCing all LCC members so that they don't accidentally reply all afterward. The next phase of this process is the group deliberation phase, which occurs during the voting meeting. Once the LCC tallies and ranks its submitted applications from highest to lowest, the work is essentially done. At this point, LCCs can simply block approve the top-ranked applications until their allocation funding is completely exhausted and then block deny the rest of the applications. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that after going through this process, if an LCC is ever to deny a top-ranked application or approve a below-average application, there really should be published criteria in place to justify that decision. This avoids the appearance of favoritism and arbitrary or biased decision making, and ultimately will lessen the likelihood of reconsideration requests being submitted. All right, so this is a sample voting meeting grant tracking document that many LCCs will use to navigate the voting meeting process and the grant decisions process. This has been stripped from a lot of different columns and rows of information that I've seen on LCCs to really just kind of touch upon some of the key data points that should be included in an Excel file like this. So you should have obviously, the project title, the applicant, and in some cases, any other bits of information that would be relevant or in some ways connected to the LCC's local criteria. So like project discipline as an example in this particular case. The other two bits of information you want to have is the total project budget for the application and the amount requested. And the reason that those two bits of information are important is because LCCs cannot award a grant amount that exceeds either of those two numbers. So having that information here ensures that an LCC won't accidentally do that. The last bit of information that you would want to have in this file is the total amount of dollars that the LCC will be granting out during the cycle, and then inputting a very simple formula that can track uh, that in real time. And I'll kind of demonstrate that here. So let's say we wanted to award an additional $500 to this applicant. Now it shows that we have negative $500. So we've over granted by $500. So having that simple formula here ensures that an LCC doesn't accidentally under or over grant. So having that there is important. Um, so now, again, this is a hypothetical LCC. As you could see, there were 51 submitted applications. This yellow bar here indicates what the average score was. So from the beginning, an LCC can approach their voting meeting with this information simply from going top to the bottom until their total allocation amount is exhausted. And applying that methodology here would yield these dark green applications to be fully funded. This slightly lighter green application would be partially funded to exhaust the remaining amount of funds that the LCC had available to grant out. And now these light green applications just represent the remaining applications that came through that were scored above the average score within this applicant pool. Now, again, there are many, many different ways in which an LCC can do this, but one of the things that we want to drive home is the point of if an LCC wanted to grant any one of these light green applications or even an application that is below the average score. That can still happen, but as I stated previously, that those decisions would really need to be justified with an LCC's local guidelines. And as an example, let's say this hypothetical LCC wanted to ensure an even or an equitable distribution of grants based upon project discipline, which is why I added that category here. So as you could see within these dark green grants, you don't see dance, but there's dance right here. So if one of these dark green grants were going to be partially funded to fund this particular dance application to make sure that they're spreading their funding out to as many different project disciplines as possible, if that's something that's has been adopted and has been published as their local guideline or prioritization, then something along those lines makes sense. All right, so other voting meeting tips to keep in mind include having the full LCC at some point before the voting meeting, say in August or September, develop a process for handling disagreements among LCC members. This can really help mitigate the likelihood that people could feel that their voices aren't being heard. Next, and this is specifically for those light green above average applications we mentioned earlier, if you notice that there were LCC members who scored a particular aspect of an application differently, for example, let's say that if one person on a 5-point scale gave an applicant a 4, while another LCC member gave them a 2, it's great in situations like that to invite those particular members to speak and to elaborate on why they scored the application the way they did. In some cases, this can help unveil an aspect of the application that presumably, no one else noticed. And when addressed in a group setting, it can really potentially sway the rest of the members to reconsider their vote or score. This is why it's essential to apply this approach only to the above average applications, because a shift in scoring could result in an applicant's total score now falling within the high scoring range. Next, if they arise, acknowledge personal and subjective commentary as such and ask the LCC to disregard them. Now, there is a great deal of nuance here. So using sound judgment is really the best anyone can be expected to do in situations like this. For example, there are many comments that can be considered valid or invalid. Uh, One example of a valid comment could be when an LCC member feels that a project doesn't meet the basic definition for the arts, humanities, or sciences as stipulated in the LCC guidelines. This is a legitimate concern, and I've seen discussions like this occur frequently during voting meetings. However, something that's more along the lines of being invalid is when an LCC member emphatically wants to deny an application simply because they don't like the person who submitted it. Lastly, as the LCC approaches, or excuse me, as the LCC approves or denies applications during the meeting, someone else who feels comfortable navigating the grants management system can approve or deny those applications in GMS in real time, since it's something that LCCs have to do anyways at some point. Specifically for denied applications, a drop-down menu in GMS will appear listing several denial reasons from which an LCC must select. After choosing an option, a secondary text box will appear, allowing LCCs to enter additional context to give the applicant a better understanding of why their application was denied. And if any notes or feedback were collected from the LCC regarding a denied applicant, entering this information can really help the applicant, potentially even produce a stronger application next year. All right, so now let's shift to implementing this process. You'll want to start by drafting an internal plan and a timeline for doing this work. The news cycle report, which is due by August 28th, enables LCCs to publish their local priorities and guidelines, which helps prospective applicants draft proposals that are more aligned with their LCC's local criteria. Next, you'll want to set a deadline for when the LCC should finish reviewing and evaluating submitted applications. And as a general reference, a good formula to use would be 1 week for every 10 applications that have been assigned to a person. Next, you'll want to select a person or create a subcommittee to compile evaluation scores and feedback using Excel or another system in preparation for the LCC's first voting meeting deliberation. Lastly, you'll want to draft internal guidance for LCC members to follow when they're reviewing their assigned applications. All right, so what are the benefits of an evaluative grant making process? What's the point of all this? First and foremost, this process allows for a much more efficient, effective, and equitable way of evaluating grants and making granting decisions. From an efficiency standpoint, it saves a great deal of time by organizing application reviews to focus deliberations on high-ranked applications, which are the ones that are most likely to be approved. Ultimately, this approach eliminates the time crunch challenges that LCCs experience, and it provides structure to voting meeting deliberations and the overall process for evaluating grants and tallying scores. From an effective standpoint, it yields valuable data, which empowers LCCs to say no when needed, allowing them to say yes to much more impactful projects that align with their community's needs. And by doing so, this resolves the quote minimal eligibility mindset we mentioned earlier. Likewise, because of the information provided by the scoring data, LCCs should no longer fear denying applicants because they know that their decisions were the results of a thorough and well-informed process. Lastly, from an equity standpoint, this approach helps mitigate biased thinking and commentary, allowing decision-making to be based purely on an application's alignment with established criteria. Before we conclude the webinar, we would like to leave you with a few additional resources on the subject. One is a link to last year's voting meeting prep webinar, which covers what needs to be done before, during, and after the voting meeting, and it quite extensively covers situations regarding conflict of interest procedures. Next, we have a link to the evaluating grants section within the LCC toolkit on our website. Lastly, we've scheduled an office hour via Zoom on Monday, September 8th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time for LCCs interested in implementing an evaluative review process for the fiscal 26 cycle. This will be an opportunity for LCCs to connect with us and other LCCs on this topic. That concludes the evaluative grant making webinar. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you on September 8th or one of the other webinars we'll be hosting over the next few months. Thank you and have a good rest of your day.